Greetings and welcome back to another edition of MGTOW Talks. I am here with the one and only Adam Jensen, whom most of you know by now, and we are here to talk about the precarious state of science, namely the topic of, or address the question of, is science fundamentally broken? And by that, of course, we mean the methodology, how it works, how science is conducted, essentially. So, without further ado, I will bring the discussion over to the actual scientist, Adam Jensen, aging geneticist, biologist, and former neuroscientist and augmented human being as he is, to, begin the discussion. So, Adam Jensen, there is a perception, it's kind of like almost a pop perception, that there's something fundamentally wrong with science. We certainly see issues with science with regards to sort of the human sciences, biology and psychology, and how these things interact. A lot of the conclusions people have come to, particularly in MGTOW circles and elsewhere, are not politically correct and seemingly can't be represented in science for that reason alone, or at least for the potential of them, of certain viewpoints of not being politically correct. So, is science broken? Is there a way around this? And how can we best proceed in discussing this?
First of all, thanks again for having me on. Always glad
to
be on your channel. So to actually answer the question, is science fundamentally broken? No. Is it healthy? No. It's in a state of not exactly disrepair, but its health could be drastically improved. I mean, we still do have massive successes. The discovery of the Higgs boson at CERN, their continuing work, the groundbreaking discovery of gene editing through CRISPR-Cas9, and the various continued discoveries in aging research, just to name a few, that demonstrate that it's clearly still working well, but it's still faced with a myriad of issues that are significantly altering its ability to function.
Yeah.
And so I think a good example to begin with about one of these issues is there was a recent kerfuffle, to use a good word, about a paper that was published titled Trajectory Analysis of the Campus Serial Rapist Assumption. And essentially, what this paper had done was provide evidence contrary to an earlier paper published in 2002 that pushed forward this heavily policy influencing, and by policy I mean American policy influencing paper that suggested the cause of rape on college campuses is primarily due to a bunch of serial rapist guys running around. And to do a quick quote from the contrary paper, although a small group of men perpetrated rape across multiple college years, they constituted a significant minority of those who committed college rape and did not compose the group at the highest risk of perpetrating rape when entering college. Exclusive emphasis on serial predation to guide risk identification, judicial response, and rape prevention is misguided. And the bee's nest, or hornet's nest, that this effectively rattled led to the author of the first paper, a man by the name of Jim Hopper, to effectively go through non-orthodox or unorthodox means to try and effectively silence this research. What he did was he pushed for the university that the author of this paper, Kevin Swarthout, at GSU, and pushed for the university that he worked at to do a research misconduct investigation, which I believe took about 2 months. And the university complied and went through with the investigation, and found no evidence of wrongdoing. And so there are a lot of issues wrapped up in this example. First of all, the policy issues. So this 2002 paper about rape on campus is a serial rapist issue. One of the things that you'll hear about, if you dig a little bit into college rape, false rape accusations, things like that, is this piece of legislation called Title IX.
Yeah, I've heard about it. I mean, not living in the States and having not been in university for a long time, I've heard about this. Well, actually, I'll let you, since you're talking, why don't you just tell us exactly what Title IX is?
So Title IX states, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. However, this has been interpreted by the United States Department of Education in 2011, writing a guidance titled the, quote, Dear Colleague Letter, that imposed new obligations on schools to address campus sexual violence, because it was decided that sexual assaults on a campus is a form of discrimination. And the issues that arose from this paper, this original paper, included one of these regulations establishing effectively on universities kangaroo courts and from the guidance itself, the way that cases are settled is not in the traditional beyond reasonable doubt standard of any other court, where you do any other sort of crime. The system that's in place is a quote unquote preponderance of evidence, which is described as 51% chance of the accused being guilty.
I mean, as I said, I've heard of Title IX, but if there's a universal standard in the American court system of beyond a reasonable doubt, I'm still not clear as to how that could be circumvented by some other system or some other standard or of weights and measures, as it were.
Universities have their own form of what can appear to be a court system. It's more along the line of like a conflict resolution center is usually what they're called.
So it's not actually a court.
It's not legal.
Right.
Or it's not a legal court. It's effectively how they decide whether or not to kick out a student. And the thing is, in addition, this has led to one strike rules. So if you're, say, one of the Duke scandal students from what was almost a decade ago, I believe, somewhere along the lines of that, when some lacrosse players were accused of raping a woman who, and it was later disproven, if they had been shown to be guilty, even though it actually didn't happen via this 51% chance guilty rule. That's one strike, they're out of the university. And once you're kicked out of a university because of this, and of course, naturally, because of your face being splattered everywhere, you're not getting back into college, which is, in the United States, going to be a difficult issue for you economically and socially. But unless you had some other questions about, did you have any other questions about?
No. I think you explained that pretty well.
Okay. So, but the thing is, the reason I bring this up isn't to complain about Title IX, despite how horrible it is.
Let's face it, a lot of people, the usual anti-feminist crowd has talked a lot about Title IX, and it's not something that's unknown per se.
Exactly. And so the thing is, what this is about how the original author, the one who influenced this policy, or influenced legislators and members of the Department of Education, responded. Not only did he push for the conflicting papers, authors' investigation for effectively fraud, he also hired an independent investigator. And so what this represents is one of the inherent problems in modern science. It influences policy and politicians who are not equipped to evaluate research. And this influence can incentivize researchers to intimidate and even attempt to silence other researchers who publish things that disagree with them. And to quote from a paper that I had referenced before, the Why Most Published Research Findings Are False by John Ioannidis in PLOS Biology, quote, prestigious investigators may suppress via the peer review system, and from this example, outside the peer review system process, the appearance and dissemination of findings that refute their findings, thus condemning their field to perpetuate false dogma.
This strikes me as something that is born largely of human ego to some degree. I mean, you're a scientist or a researcher, you produce something, and someone comes out and says, well, no, we don't, actually that's not right, or here's a paper contradicting that. Before we get in further to how broken science may or may not be, I mean, certainly there's an element of just sort of human weakness, frailty, baseness, where it's just like people are working with their egos. I mean, we have this image of a scientist as a sort of the rational thinker, someone who's dedicated to understanding the world, and I think we forget the amount of pettiness that sometimes goes into this. I think I've talked about this before, but father has a Hungarian friend who for a while he ended up getting a job in Hungary, moving back after he had become a naturalized citizen in the United States. But his field was geophysics, and he, all the ego stuff. They wouldn't even entertain his ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that also goes in line with what you're saying is another quote from that same Ioannidis paper, which is, quote, many otherwise seemingly independent university-based studies may be conducted for no other reason than to give physicians and researchers qualifications for promotion or tenure. Such non-financial conflicts may also lead to distorted reported results and interpretations. So this is a thing. It basically can turn scientists against each other. This quest for tenure, this quest for promotion, this quest for the ever dwindling supply of grants and scientific funding. And we can get into that aspect later, but this is a large issue. A lot of perverse incentives have twisted the mindsets of scientists into thinking that this sort of behavior is acceptable.
Hmm. Yeah, but I mean, is this an issue of? I mean, it's a issue of science, but it's an issue of just human beings being human beings to some degree.
Right. I mean, humans respond to incentives.
Yeah.
So if you had similar incentives in some other field, you'd have roughly the same issues. Just they would be fleshed out in different routes. Um, and so it's it's like, say, elections. The incentives there encourage mudslinging and just nasty behavior. So it's not unique to science. Humans, as you say, are humans, hairless apes.
Yeah. Well, hairless, various degrees.
To various degrees, yes.
Yeah. But yeah.
But as a note, so this is instances of people going around peer review and attacking other scientists through pushing for uh, fraud investigations and things like that. Fortunately, those more extreme, I won't even call them behaviors, just perverse actions are not widespread. I just think this is a good example of how incentives can cause some extreme antisocial, effectively, behavior.
Yeah. Well, so fair enough. But what's the solution here? I mean, it's obviously a serious problem, but
Well, so there are a few solutions, and uh, none of them are perfect, naturally.
all right, solution.
But I would argue that one of the best things, or one important aspect of shifting mindsets than the incentives of scientists, honestly, is to uh, abolish or have a sunset on tenure, because the much like unions, it was presented originally as a useful mechanism for protecting employees. With unions, it would be workers. With tenure, it would be professors. And with tenure, it was initially presented as a way, and an important way, an effective way of protecting professors' academic freedom. And so, for example, if you're at a publicly funded university, meaning that you're under the protection of constitutional rights, um, if you want to espouse certain political opinions and positions, um, either outside of the classroom or present them as a potential viewpoint within the classroom when appropriate, say, for example, discussing the merits of, say, markets and a philosophy of econ course, that that would be fine. Naturally, a good professor would present the viewpoints that they have, the evidence that they have, say, for or against, and then present conflicting viewpoints. But academic freedom did need to be protected in order to prevent public universities from firing professors based off of political viewpoints, and it kind of stemmed from the Red Scare, essentially,
Which
from a
is,
historical perspective.
yeah, super old. I mean,
Yeah,
decades and decades. We're talking going back to like McCarthyism and stuff.
exactly. And the thing is, um, it may it is still useful to a degree, but the benefits of tenure are clearly now being outweighed by the uh, perverse incentives and new behaviors that we are seeing in tenured professors who effectively use that position to do various things, such as one, be terrible professors, put forth as minimal effort as possible in performing their duties as professors outside of research, and two, uh, something somewhat similar to these a zero sum game um, in climbing up the scientific ladder, and so creating this unhealthy type of competition between scientists. If you're both fighting for tenure, uh, and one of them gets it, that tenure uh, is a very, very thick shield. You have to be incredibly, you have to do something way off mark to get fired. Um,
Make a Larry Summers style comment.
well, you see, the thing is,
Well, he wasn't a
even
tenured professor, but still.
yeah, a tenured professor would be able to get away with that.
Huh. Yeah, I suppose.
At the very least, he wouldn't be able to be fired. Would he receive censure from fellow people, members of his field? Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
But he would not be fired for
Mm.
saying that.
He'd become unpopular, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. And in some fields, especially smaller fields, where when you where the peer reviewers can quite often be people who may work at the same university. Oh, and by the way, peer review, when done, the reviewers are anonymous to the author. Uh, Peer reviewers can say reject papers, cover it up with an example of a complaint about some aspect of the research, but actually have the true motivation of thinking the person is, say, a racist or a sexist.
No. Hmm. Hmm. But I mean, what's your view on? I mean, is tenure really a? Hmm. I suppose in some sense it's a good protective shield in the current atmosphere. But I mean, do you have any criticisms of the tenure system?
So my further criticisms of the tenure system uh, would be similar to my further criticisms of unions as they are today. Uh, there's a reason why over 90% of private industries lack unions. Um, it raises the cost of of a company's bottom line, and unless everybody in your industry has a union, you will be at a competitive disadvantage. Um, this is something that you can find quite easily in economic research, um, and it's one of those things where in the past it served a role. It allowed for uh, dangerous working conditions to be another avenue to address dangerous working conditions, even though working conditions improve regardless as wealth increases in a country. Um, but yeah, it basically can encourage a lack of motivation, poor performance, because it's essentially a massive shield that says I can't be fired unless I assault someone.
Hmm.
And so with that incentive over a long enough time, and with the United States being much larger than it was when tenure was first adopted, uh, thus leading to the increase in the number of universities and the increase in the number of professors, and therefore professors with tenure, you're basically getting a bigger sample size to flip that coin of, is this person with tenure going to be, one, someone who deserved the tenure, and two, someone who's going to behave well while having tenure.
Hmm. Okay, now what are some further obstacles or problems involved in science and scientific research?
So one of the main problems in scientific research today would be the system of peer review itself. Um, Initially adopted by nature for the same reason why it's having trouble today, which is in the 1970s, which is the drastic increase in the number of publications. Um, Seeking, or the of research papers seeking the state of being published in a journal. Peer review was introduced as a mechanism to sort of kind of decrease the number, have a sort of final golden standard, and essentially just save time and money for the journals themselves. However, it's this same reasoning that tenure, or that peer review is now a problem, or is now facing severe problems. Peer review is heavily overworked, and so what you have is, with the ever increasing number of people pursuing PhDs, such as myself, we have this incentive of publish or perish, where in order to be an effective scientist, one that can get grants for funding, one that can get positions in academia, et cetera, this mentality has basically provided a perverse incentive of quantity over quality. And actually, to quote a paper from PLOS Biology, titled Reforming Science, Methodological and Cultural Reforms, it's an editorial. The authors actually refer to it as publish and still perish. So, and to quote from the paper, to emphasize what I'd said before, much of the recent scientific literature is repetitive, unimportant, poorly conceived, or executed and oversold. Perhaps deservingly, much of it is ignored. However, the sheer number of papers generates an enormous burden on the peer review system. Yeah. And so, as the pool of qualified peer reviewers is inadequate to meet demands, the critical role of peer review in screening and correcting manuscripts prior to publication cannot properly function. And that is a perfect description of the problem. Peer review is simply overworked, and not even that. because of this publish or perish, or publish and still perish mentality, nobody wants to do peer review because, one, when it's paid, it's very little, and two, the actual impact it has on improving, say, your CV or resume is negligible compared to publications. To say
Something
that,
else that strikes me in this context is that the accelerated rate at which publication is sort of required. I mean, doesn't this ultimately disincentivize, perhaps even unconsciously, well thought out, thorough research that might take longer than is permissible within the bounds of what's sort of expected in terms of how much you have to produce and publish?
absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, what we're starting to see in a in another paper that was measuring retractions since 1975. This was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This paper basically demonstrated that since 1970, let's see, so from 1973, the percentage of articles retracted for fraud or suspected fraud has increased from below 1% to nearly 10% as of 2010. Now, a good part of this percentage can be explained sort of similar to the rise of, say, autism spectrum diagnoses. We just have better means of catching fraudulent papers. Simply having, say, the internet, it's going to be a lot easier to detect, say, plagiarism in 2010 than it is in 1975.
Yeah.
So, and that is a good proportion of the papers that are being retracted. And so, but still, about out of all the retracted papers published, and this paper was looking at PubMed, an online repository of publications. It was analyzing all of the retracted papers up until 2015 or 2012, and that what we're seeing is that actually more than 50% of the publications were retracted because of fraud, suspected fraud, and plagiarism.
Doesn't really give you much hope on the scientific front. I mean, the public projection, or the public image of science, the one that's projected into the public is, like I said, these sort of rational, methodical thinkers working towards the betterment of humanity and blah, 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 blah. But it's just as fucked up an industry as, I don't know, I hate to say it, like the fast food industry in some sense.
Or the pharmaceutical industry.
Or the farm, yeah. I mean, I guess wherever there's human activity, it's going to be fraught with problems and peril, for lack of a better term.
And there's another aspect. The amount of time it takes for all cause retraction on average is 33 months, or almost 3 years, and 47 months for fraud, fabrication, or falsification. 47 months, or 4 years, which that's a long time between publication and retraction. And so there's reason to be concerned. But at the same time, this is, again, a fraction of publications. So this is somewhere around 55% papers of 10% of papers that happen to be on PubMed. So it's not like the incredibly high. It's not like an incredibly high percentage of all papers, but it's still significant. It's something to be concerned about, and it can be understandable as to why you can have this issue stemming from an overworked peer review system for another reason, and that is the fact that there's effectively an oligopoly in the market of journals. There's Science, Nature, Cell, etc., and a handful of others that most authors strive to publish towards. And so that does not help with the overworking, and it leads to the same problems that any other market or any other industry that has oligopolism, and it decreases quality. You need more competition. In fact, there is another paper that's been published about the danger of truth in science publishing. It's titled Truth in Science Publishing, a Personal Perspective in PLOS Biology. And one of the things that the authors talk about is, quote, there is no real competition between journals as the conduit for communicating science. Capitalism thrives and depends on competition. And the majority of high-profile journals are run by a few companies with significant profits, and it's very hard for newcomers to break into this system. So this decreases the economic pressure on journals to invest in high-quality peer review. It's much like the monopolists not necessarily having to produce the best product at the lowest price. They can behave badly.
They can release Windows 10 and claim it's so much better than 7 and 8, and all the other iterations in between. Yeah, not a fan of that.
Yeah, so it's a severe issue, and then toss in the fact that since about 1970, we see this switch in funding of research going from private to public, and yet grants from public institutions such as the NIH have steadily been declining in reward rates from about 50% in 1965 to 20% in 2010. So you still have a public majority of research funding, but it's just because of the nature of essentially regime uncertainty, political instability. These institutions that are supposed to be providing us with scientific research are not giving out funding as much. And so that gives another avenue for researchers wanting to publish as much as possible, cut corners, potentially occasionally commit fraud in order to get published so they can get funding, so they can be part of that 20%. And so this reliance on this politically unstable public funding drastically encourages this nasty behavior between scientists, like between Jim Hopper, the 2002 rape paper, and Swarthout.
Yeah. Okay, now we've covered a fair bit. Let's talk about the reproduction crisis, maybe.
So much like John Ioannidis had mentioned in his paper about why most published research findings are false, over 50% of biomedical research papers can't be replicated. There is also a recent attempt where of 100 psychology papers being evaluated via strict replication. Effectively, what had happened was 100 papers, published psychology papers, were selected at random, given to researchers, and those researchers, matching the original protocol, attempted to replicate the original results of the paper. However, less than half of those published papers successfully were replicated. They could not replicate the original results. And to sort of emphasize the issue a little bit further, in a survey done by the journal Nature, 70% of 1,500 interviewed researchers have failed to reproduce another scientist's experiments. And there's, again, another incentive, or there is that incentive of funding and publication that just discourages individuals from wanting to actually replicate findings. I mean, if it's already hard enough to get funding from the majority funding source, you're not going to improve your chances of getting funding by saying, hey, I'd like to do this experiment that's been done before exactly the same way.
Yeah.
To see if it's still legit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty depressing, the picture you're painting, but it gets even more depressing, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's this term called leaky pipelines. And so what you see is in an article about people receiving PhDs and the people who receive these PhDs actually going on to becoming faculty in the United States. So what they found was that women receive nearly 50% of all PhDs in the United States, but only about 17% of those women who received those PhDs went on to become tenured science faculty, despite the fact that in a University of Michigan paper establishing a 2-to-1 bias in favor of tenure evaluations in favor of women, you see this lack of desire when polling women pursuing a PhD. The majority of females pursuing a PhD do not actually see themselves going into research.
Presumably, this is due to, well, standard reasons, right? I mean, women, they're just not, there are reasons why they're not as ambitious and don't want to do the same things as men do. So presumably.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, women with PhD degrees, and young children are 35% less likely than men with young children um, to go forward and become a member of the United States science faculty. And the same thing applies for minority applicants, but there are most likely different reasons for that. And so, but even without children, um, women with a PhD are 28% less likely to obtain tenure than men without children. It's And so basically, you have all of these institutions, most of which are public, spending public research funding to train this near 50% group into becoming scientists and professors. And you're seeing a significant loss of investment. And that is a large problem, even like strictly just from a funding perspective. It's discouraging. And to correct myself, it's so it's not 17% of the 50 that go on. It's 17% of all science faculty. So they only make up 17%. So there's a clear, it's still a significant drop off, but not as significant as I'd mistakenly said before. Yeah, so leaky pipelines are an issue. And there's also administrative burden. Just something that I've experienced personally, and just seeing excellent scientists who can come up with, design, and conduct excellent research, spending most of their time in their offices, writing grants, writing project paperwork. Exactly. And so the same paper that discussed the leaky pipelines, and the name of this paper is Reforming Science Structural Reforms, published in Infection and Immunity. Basically what they describe is that increasing regulatory burdens and the failure of the regulatory system to clean up outdated regulations causes researchers to have to write program projects and training grants that can reach hundreds of pages in length. And so scientists are becoming their own administrative personnel. They're doing the work of administrators when they should be doing the work of scientists. And it's a terrible, terrible waste of time. It's like having basketball players effectively spend most of their time painting houses. It doesn't make sense. The thing is, though, to further kind of explain what these make up, most grants require annual or even quarterly progress reports, despite this being too short for a lot of different animal research progress rates. I mean, if you're working with a mouse, for example, mice live up to 2 years. And doing, say, even a drug test on animals that you're trying to effectively come up with an idea for a clinical trial, a new drug for blood pressure, a new drug for Alzheimer's, something like that, you're not going to have data in 3 months because it takes a lot longer than 3 months, even in a mouse, to have reliable data. But despite that, the scientists still have an incredibly high compliance rate with this regulation, most likely due to the fear of losing the grants. And yeah, it's just not compatible.
You know, man, it's depressing.
Yeah, and like one of the ironies of specifically, say, animal research. So, in order to do an experiment that involves mice or vertebrate animals, you have to do extensive documentation of the experiments. You have to justify why you're doing each experiment. And as an example, euthanasia needs extremely detailed methods. So, for example, let's say you're trying to study Alzheimer's and you're using mice as a model because you don't want to, human samples are even harder. Human patients are even harder to work with. Yeah. So you're trying to do work on mice with Alzheimer's, and one of the important aspects of that is taking a look at what's going on in their brain cells. So you naturally can't really keep a mouse alive after taking out its brain, so you need to conduct euthanasia. So in order to actually have that experiment permitted, you have to have extremely detailed methods to avoid pain and suffering as much as possible. And the irony comes in wherein you or I can walk into any hardware store and we can buy mouse traps, glue pads, poison. We can kill mice, rats, like it's nothing. And arguably these ways are incredibly cruel. And it's simply this weird contradiction that you see. Not that I'm proposing that scientists use glue pads and mouse traps in order to kill their mice, but yeah.
Well, I mean, barring vegans, I think, so that's before, there's kind of separate issue, but there's a argument that can be made from a perspective of neurological complexity. I mean, I think to approximate results in humans, you need to obviously do work on fellow mammals. I mean, working on flies, mice are much closer to humans than flies are, right? So,
yeah, absolutely.
So I think within, the ends do justify the means. I think in this type of research. Otherwise, we can't make any progress. We can just,
or we'll be drastically slowed.
Yeah.
Again, the issue here isn't the fact that scientists have to use CO2 chambers to painlessly kill animals. The fact is how difficult it is to get approval to do so, and how extensive your explanation has to be, how much time you have to spend just saying, hey, I'm doing this experiment. Involves looking at brain structure after a treatment. I want to see if it's effective. And so in order to look at the brain structure, I'm going to have to take out the brain in these mice, and I'll be using, humane means to kill them.
I guess lethal injection.
Like lethal injection is one method. The most common is using CO2.
Oh, okay.
It's actually
painless. Don't even notice it.
Yeah, they just fall asleep. So the fact that the technology is out there and widely used, and is arguably quite effective in preventing unnecessary chemical damage to the brain. So, like for instance, if you were doing a lethal injection, that could there's the possibility of that causing stress or influence crossing the blood-brain barrier. If one of the compounds in the lethal injection can do that, that can influence your results. CO2, also naturally, any way that you kill an animal in order to look at its brain is going to influence your results, but the complete minimization of stress and the limited influences on the physiology of the mouse or the rat makes it much more. It explains why it's so popular.
Yeah. It's man, so many issues. But so talking about all these problems, since you're involved in the research and you're involved in science, there must be ways of improving this. I mean, it might not be perfect, but and there are examples of success stories in scientific research and what have you. So,
oh, absolutely. I mean, the discovery of CRISPR-Cas is
yeah, that's a really huge one. I actually want to make a video on that eventually. I'm not sure if I want to intertwine it with something else related, or I haven't decided. But yeah, that's a huge one. Yeah.
I mean, that is huge. That is really going to have. It is having significant impacts on the precision of affecting human health. I mean, a lot of diseases are because of a single mutation.
Yeah.
And if you can use CRISPR-Cas to alter that mutation so that it's harmless, you've just cured a disease.
Yeah. Yeah, it's huge, and that's why I want to make a separate video about that technology, but just would be beyond the scope of this video. But
certainly, and so even with all these hurdles, even with all these problems, science marches on. So there are ways to bring the health of science back to a good state or a better state. So say with peer review, one of the ways that you could address the issue of this overworked nature of peer review is to reduce the workload by applying the successful preprint system. And what preprints are effectively where a scientist will submit data, protocols, results, etc., online publicly prior to peer review, similar to systems that mathematics, physics, and computer science have, with their systems being Archive and GitHub. And what it allows for is two very beneficial things. It allows for feedback, so that other scientists can look at your work, say, hey, this protocol can interfere with your results, or this your conclusions may not be justified by this data, and here's why. And an even more important benefit, especially in a climate of fiscal limitations, is it allows effectively for stake claiming or placing. And so if you put out your work in a preprint and then you go on to publish it, you can always point to your original work and say, I was the first one to do this. So if, for instance, two authors were about to publish and the other, and both had been ideally been putting things on to a preprint system like Archive, well, hopefully initially they would have run into each other. But if not, the journal can effectively fix the dispute by looking to see, okay, which one had actually completed a sufficient amount of work to justify giving them the publication. And that would be easier. And in fact, there's already, in biomedical research, there's already a journal that is practicing this, and it's called PeerJ. And they, after 3 years, are already profitable, which is a very quick turnaround in the oligopoly that is big journals, effectively. And that kind of brings me on to the second improvement, which would be the encouragement of students and researchers alike to publish in open access journals like PLOS. And that would encourage more papers like PeerJ to be able to enter the market and become profitable and help, one, break up the oligopoly, which, two, reduces the strain on peer review. As for the reproduction crisis, ever since basic research funding switched to majority public funding around the 70s, research depends on the political climate. If you're trying to do a long-term experiment, whether or not you actually go after it can be affected by whether or not it's an election year, whether or not the people in Congress decide to increase or decrease funding of the majority of your sources. So, as we have seen, as a sort of positive note, there's already progress in this area. The entrance of more private funding into science should be welcomed. We should be happy to see that private funding is increasingly more prevalent as alternative options to the decreasing sources of public funding. And with that comes stability. If you as a researcher don't have to worry about whether or not your funding will shift because of some politician being elected or not during an election year, and you've simply gotten a private grant from, say, Peter Thiel or from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or from IBM, those institutions funnily enough, are a lot more stable, and that reduces a lot of your stress as a researcher to through the reduction of the mentality of publish or perish, because most private philanthropists aren't necessarily interested in you publishing a whole bunch of papers. The reason why a good number of these philanthropists are entering and giving money to scientists is because they want a result of, say, a cure for Alzheimer's, like the Van Andels that I had mentioned in a previous video. So they don't really care if you publish 20 papers or 2 papers. What they care about is if you can say, hey, I've been doing a good job with the money you've given me. And that is a much healthier incentive structure than we'll give you money if you just shit out a whole bunch of papers.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think there's any hope of, well, you mentioned some, but do you think there's any hope in the next decade or so of the structure that you suggested becoming a majority or something that most people consider to be the best way to proceed?
So I certainly don't expect the shift of funding to go back
It's
to
almost
being
like
private.
government gridlock, it seems. It's just that can't get anything done really.
Yeah, and it's not even a it's not even a red shirt versus blue shirt kind of issue. It's just an issue of most politicians are not scientists. And so if funding is going to be public, then that means it's going to be handled by people who know little to nothing
Yeah,
about science.
with the slogan, we just need more scientists. I mean, this has always struck me as particularly dumb because I mean, having, you know, a million extra scientists with severe constraints and restrictions on what they can do, what's the point?
Yeah.
You know, uh, I mean, to quote Soldier 76, you know, what's the point? Just there's no. You need to change the system. Uh, it's like trying to get a good guy into. Well, I mean, I'm way past my sort of libertarian stage, but like Ron Paul, I think he's still a decent guy, and he has some okay ideas. And he, back in the day, he was a congressman, but the system was so broken that a lot of his good ideas and compromises and whatever just never go through. So he was sort
Yeah.
of a voice of opposition. People paid attention. He went through a period of flourishing in the mid 2000s, but onwards. But it's just so what? You get the
The
system just
perfect description for the libertarian movement.
yeah, pretty much. Like everyone, yeah, look, my ideas. Hey, all these scientists here, like get them on board to do stuff. And I even remember this was eons ago, a call that a guy, I think he was working in biology, I believe. He called into Stefan Molyneux, and he was just talking about just how some of the things we've talked about here, bad the peer review system is, just the kind of junk that's produced, and it just does. And he almost felt like I don't know what happened after all, but he almost felt like just quitting. Like there's almost something fraudulent about it, you know, and that on say the taxpayer's dime, and
Yeah.
I don't even politicians are just such a waste of space. They're I mean, what does it take to be a politician? Have a slick tongue. The vast majority of them have no background in science. They don't understand what's required. They don't even really have an interest. I mean, I could imagine somebody getting involved in politics for that, but it just, yeah, I don't. The current system just isn't serving us well, and yeah, and yeah, we've talked about this before. The public being a major source of funding and being intimately tied to the government doesn't really bode well long term for efficient scientific research because government is by its nature not efficient. It's great for gridlocking stuff and never get anything done. So if people have really shitty ideas or shitty legislation, it can be good because maybe it'll never happen. But you know that's hardly a great thing. I mean, it's one benefit,
Yeah.
I suppose, but all this other stuff just you end up with the crap that scientists have to go through. And I imagine once you fully get into your scientific career, realistically, you're going to be part of the no pun intended the rat race. Well, we're talking about mice, but yeah, the other rodent, the ones with the hairless tails. I mean, you're gonna be part of that at least for some period of time,
Yeah.
unless and presumably eventually you'll get in some sort of private sector. But yeah, I don't envy scientists that. And there's the idea of a scientist sitting and writing grants. I mean, you said the analogous to sort of basketball players painting houses. I think it's more like basketball players, you know, doing all their tax reforms, earning millions and cutting deals and getting involved in contract. That's what it seems to me. It's like they should
Yeah,
just play
that's it.
basketball and other people should take care of that other administrative crap. That's the analogy to me. I mean, they shouldn't be spending weeks on end in April looking at their millions. It just doesn't make any sense. They can they have enough money to hire other people to do it. It's useless. I mean, and imagine if you wanted to keep the whole write a grant system, you could pay people that's good writers who have some knowledge of science but aren't scientists themselves just to explain the basics. Maybe have a meeting or something with the scientists who are going to make or produce the research and that kind of thing. But
Yeah, but it is just frustrating seeing really good scientists just it it, it it's it upsets me. I kind of want to say to the people over at the NIH, hey, did you hear about this thing that got invented about 200 years ago called specialization? It's really really efficient. It's
mm,
great when somebody doesn't have to do everything
yeah,
related to their industry.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, anecdotally, there were some great scientific discoveries that just weren't done in that context. People just working independently and doing stuff. There's a historical record for that.
Yeah, Newton and Leibniz on calculus.
Yeah,
And
I'm a huge Leibniz fan. Highly underrated thinker. I think he's a much more comprehensive thinker than Newton was. Newton was good with the physics and the maths, bit of a lunatic, and Leibniz had all kinds of ideas, anticipated molecules and his theory of I don't want to go on a Leibniz tirade, but anyway, yeah, I mean, and well into the 20th century, not working within this sort of rigid hierarchical grant system, blah blah blah.
and go. I'm sorry.
No, I'm done.
I was just going to say, one of the nice things is like with what you had mentioned about and industry, uh, that in and of itself is actually one of the processes that is its own self-correction. Um, Despite the we just need more scientists period mindset no matter what, um, there's a bit of a self-market correction. More and more PhDs are entering industry, be it biotech, consulting, or whatnots. Um, a lot of major institutions that train PhDs openly advertise how successful their students are at getting good positions in industry, and the um, openly advertise workshops and alternative career pathways, um, uh, voluntary groups to practice, say, consulting with real companies and things like that. And so there has been a shift, and there has where there has been self-correcting, and that is a good thing. So it's not bleak darkness.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean,
it's not great, but it's
it's
not
not
bleak darkness.
it's not U.S. government style bleak, unending darkness, pits of doom. No,
Exactly.
yeah, that is depressing when But yeah, yeah. I mean, and the thing is, people actually expect there's an expectation of some results in science, whereas I don't think anyone who has half a brain expects results from the government. So Yeah. So I guess there's a slight ray of light, silver lining in the clouds. But if you were to make the analogy of a sick man, I mean, I think the scientific world is alien at the moment and really needs. It's not broken, it's not dead, but it might be moribund, and I think it could get to the point where it could get worse too. I imagine. No, I mean,
Yeah, it it always could. I mean, it really does depend on, like, for instance, take CRISPR for example.
mm.
What if it gets banned in the United States?
Oh yeah, well, they like banning shit, don't they?
Yeah, yeah, it's a dangerous thing, especially seeing as Chinese scientists were like, "What's with this Puritanism crap? We're gonna start using this in things that matter, like human embryos."
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah,
They
and
weren't even
Puritanism is
viable, and people freaked out.
yeah. Well, I mean, thank the gods for the Chinese. I mean, I'm not exactly a fan of Maoism, and you could argue that Chairman Mao probably wiped out, through his edicts, wiped out more human beings single-handedly than anyone else in the 20th century. But the legacy of getting rid of a lot of that crap is that the Chinese have become extremely pragmatic, and I mean they can do the work. I mean they have the highest population in the world and one of as a country one of the highest mean averages. Like I mean they're going to be able to do a lot of work basically, and American Puritanism has always. I mean, there's the puritanical in the United States has always held back, good stuff, stem cell, whatever it might be. It makes people feel uncomfortable, but that is an advantage the Chinese have, and because Puritanism these days is no longer I mean, I guess if you're a traditionalist, you like the good old days, but it's not a really useful asset if you want to forge ahead and make scientific progress. So I tip my hat off to the Chinese. They'll certainly be much further ahead of the United States. So I can imagine market pressures. I mean, the Japanese, I would argue, is not too dissimilar. They don't really care about shit like that. They're trying to clone like goats and weird pools and shit like that. And
Actually,
mm,
one positive aspect of, I guess you could call it state competition.
yeah,
Um, in the aging talk, we had discussed the issue that the FDA does not currently recognize aging as a disease,
mm,
despite the immense cost and health problems associated with it, risks of diseases. Um, it's somewhat frustrating to see that this was necessary, but one major discovery in the field of aging, the supplementation of a energy currency molecule called NAD, is now undergoing human safety trials uh, by Dr. Shinichiro Amai, not in the United States, but in Japan.
yeah, but they're just a lot less puritanical. I mean, they yeah, they have their customs, but they don't have that sort of, I hate to say it, that sort of Christian legacy of just weird, irrelevant, non-ethical, yet somehow they would believe or claim ethical concerns regarding scientific research. I mean, we just can't afford this crap anymore. Hey, but if the Chinese or the Japanese are willing to do it, I mean, I'll
Or any
support
other
them
country,
silent,
really.
or any other country. I just think, um, you know, let's be realistic. There aren't, you're not going to see this kind of research done in the Arab world for religious reasons, as well as probably IQ related reasons, as well as a host of other countries. So you're basically looking at East Asia, European countries as well, I imagine, but they don't have the same puritanical tradition, but they're still, I guess, stuck in that quagmire of quote unquote ethical concerns and what have you. So really, it's only East Asia that's going to get anything done in this regard for a while, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, uh, Europe, the EU's kind of lukewarm reception to GMOs, and I believe they're issuing mandatory labeling and whatnot.
Yeah, the
Um,
EU or Europe suffers from a kind of almost I wouldn't even it's not a religious Puritanism. It's
a
kind of a
secular
I call it
Puritanism.
it's like a socialist Puritanism. It's like, oh, will this benefit humans and we have to, it's, but you end up with the same result really, and it just kind of hinders human progress. So yeah, I mean yeah, I think we can only really put our stock and hope in the East Asian countries. And I said in that video I put out on East Asian IQ and what have you,
Hmm.
the Bloomberg report shows Japan and South Korea, the top innovators, and so I think we can see good stuff coming from there. And I guess if
Absolutely.
you're ever looking for work, maybe one of their universities will be uh, willing to hire you and do the tough research that the good Christians in the United States wouldn't allow you to do.
Yeah, exactly.
I've always, I don't know, I mean, I guess it's just part of my personality, my interest, but sort of exalting in the past and slowing down progress because it's, you're somehow venerating traditions. I just don't, what's the point?
It's fortunately fading away at a very slow rate.
Yeah. Well, but the
Very,
problem is this is such a critical juncture. You mentioned CRISPR, and like I said, I'll maybe make a separate video about that at some point in time. It's really important gene-related technology, but slowly isn't good enough. Not at the current point in time. We need people to be engaged in this stuff, and we just need to get rid of all these blockades, and it's just not worth it.
I think if researchers in the field of gene editing with CRISPR-Cas9 uh, learn from what an even more restricted field like mine, aging, um, is doing via marketing. So that whole uh, doing a voluntary or doing a extremely low dose uh, clinical trial or safety trial with dogs
Mm.
because Americans love dogs. Um, Something along the lines of we could go from people being against gene editing because
Because God,
designer baby, my God, and whatnot, to um, say scientists using it to cure Huntington's disease in a simple and safe manner, that could effectively shift the conversation towards um, it being immoral not to support it. It's like, oh, so
yeah.
you want people to have Huntington's disease?
Well, and I don't want to, where we've been talking for a while. I don't want to get too far along in questions of gene editing and genetic
Absolutely.
engineering, but I think there will be a natural progression. I mean, it's going to start with treating diseases, and I have a video planned on this topic as well. So maybe we should just, I think we've been talking for a while, we should wrap it up there. I mean, some prospects out there, but overall the picture looks pretty bleak, I'd say, in resume. Um, any final thoughts, Adam Jensen?
Um, I wish my ex would stop helping the Illuminati. That's all
Oh
I'm gonna say.
yeah, yeah. Well, she is a fucking Megan. She's a fucking cunt. Fucking cunt. Yeah, she's an unsavory person. I hope you don't have to deal with her again, but based on possible future DLC, it might be inevitable.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, thank you for being here and talking to me and allowing
Thank you for having me.
it's my pleasure, the audience to get a greater insight into the machinations and the inner workings, the torturous inner workings of the so-called scientific world, one which is overburdened and laden with paperwork and nonsense unrelated to science, but nonetheless, now we understand a little bit more about the trials and tribulations of scientists everywhere. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'll be linking Adam Jensen's channel in the low bar, and I'll check you out later. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.